Good morning. It is very good to see everybody here today. To our visitors, I would like to welcome you once again to our worship service and encourage you to have your Bibles open to John chapter 5. That's going to be the first passage that we read is John 5 in verses 19 through 29. We're going to be talking about the afterlife today. And one of the great passages that sums up just what is going to happen to us on the day of judgment and where we're going to spend that afterlife is here in John chapter 5. For context, let's begin in verse 19. Jesus said, "Truly, truly, I say to you, the Son can do nothing of himself unless it is something he sees the Father doing. For whatever the Father does, these things the Son also does in like manner. For the Father loves the Son and shows him all things that he himself is doing. And greater works than these will he show him, that you may marvel. For just as the Father raises the dead and gives them life, even so the Son also gives life to whom he wishes. For not even the Father judges anyone, but he has given all judgment to the Son, in order that all may honor the Son, even as they honor the Father. He who does not honor the Son does not honor the Father, him who he sent." Verse 24. "Truly, truly, I say to you, he who hears my word and believes him who sent me has eternal life and does not come into judgment, but is passed out of death into life. Truly, truly, I say to you, an hour is coming, and now is, when the dead shall hear the voice of the Son of God, and those who hear shall live. For just as the Father has life in himself, even so he gave to the Son also to have life in himself." One little point there before we finish the context. Notice here that when it comes to God, God does not require a physical body to have life. That he has life in himself. Being God, life is inherent to him. That's kind of challenging for us to think about, isn't it? Because we always see life and death being so wrapped up in the physical body. That when the physical body ceases to function, we no longer have life. We go into death. But for God, life is in him. He is life. He doesn't need a body. He doesn't need a brain. He is life, just as life is in the Son. Go to verse 27 now. "And he gave him, the Son, authority to execute judgment, because he is the Son of Man. Do not marvel at this, for an hour is coming in which all who are in the tomb shall hear his voice, and shall come forth, those who did the good deeds to a resurrection of life, and those who committed the evil deeds to a resurrection of judgment." Now, it might seem very easy and convenient for us in this company to just proceed on to a discussion of heaven and hell. Because I think most of us who are here today, I assume at least because you're here, you believe that you have a soul. You believe that that soul is eternal, will outlast your physical body, and that that soul will go somewhere after you die. But not everybody believes that. And when we go out and present the gospel to people, this is a very fundamental concept, that if somebody doesn't even believe that there is such a thing as a soul, you're going to have a really, really hard time convincing him to save said non-existent soul. So let's ask a more fundamental question than what is heaven or what is hell. It is, why should I even believe that there is an afterlife? Why should I even believe that I'm going to have something that exists spiritually beyond the physical when the physical comes to an end? There is an undeniable spiritual component to what makes you, you, at least according to the Bible. There are several passages on the screen that illustrate this. Matthew 10 and verse 28, Jesus says there's a difference between body and soul, because he says, don't fear those who can kill the body only. Rather, you should fear the one who can kill both body and soul in eternal hell, which means by inference that the body is not the same thing as the soul. 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verses 1 through 10, talks about the way that we long to be clothed in our eternal abode, that this life is like living in a tent, and the afterlife is like going to our final home. We wish to be in our home so that when this earthly tent fails, when the earthly body dies, we are still going to exist spiritually in a spiritual home. It exists in a way that is not bound by the physical or the material. Your soul outlasts your body, so there must be an abode for the dead. Go to Ecclesiastes chapter 12, and notice what is said here. Great fundamental idea here in Ecclesiastes 12 and verse 7. So the dust will return to the earth as it was, and the spirit will return to God who gave it. And again, there's a difference between body and soul. You are not your body. Your body is not you. Your body is dust from the earth. And when you die and you leave, what's going to happen to that body? It will return to the earth as it came. It will rot and it will become nothing. I don't know, by the way, why people care so much about their bodies after they die. Maybe it's a cultural thing. Maybe it's just that we're very uncomfortable with the idea of death. But I find it just interesting, and this is not a judgment, by the way, if this is what your preference is, but I find it interesting how uncomfortable people are with the idea of cremation. Well, just the idea of my body just being burned and turned into... All you're doing is just hastening what's going to happen anyway. Embalm yourself and put yourself in your favorite suit. I don't care. Eventually, your body will return to the earth and become dust just as it came. And your soul, that which will exist for eternity, is going to return to God. And as Jesus pointed out in John chapter 5, you'll either spend eternity with life, with God, or it will be an eternal death apart from the presence of God. Without continued spiritual existence after death, we're left with hopelessness and despair. Staying in the book of Ecclesiastes, when you read the book of Ecclesiastes, you read about a man who said, what if there is no God, and life is nothing but we see under the sun? Is it possible to find happiness and contentment and satisfaction on planet Earth alone? Life under the sun, no spirit, no God, none of that. And his conclusion was, vanity of vanities, all is vanity. And he gets to the end of it in chapter 12 and says that these are dark days that we experience when we near the end of our physical life. 1 Corinthians chapter 15 talks about the resurrection of Jesus, and of course he points out that if there was no resurrection of Jesus, then that means there is no resurrection for the rest of us, which means that we are the most pathetic people who have ever lived on planet Earth. Is the soul just nonsense, though? When we look at the idea of an eternal soul, a soul that will continue to exist after physical existence is over, is that just silly nonsense? Because many people in our world only believe in the material. They would consider themselves materialists or secularists or whatever term they want to call themselves. Nevertheless, they believe only in the material existence. All this talk of soul and spirit just seems like nonsense because the soul and the spirit cannot be measured scientifically. They believe that what your brain does is what you are, and that there's nothing more to it than that. Paul also noted this tendency in 1 Corinthians chapter 2. For people who only see things in a physical way, they will never be able to look beyond the physical and see the spiritual side of life, he says, beginning in verse 12. Now we have received not the spirit of the world, but the Spirit who is from God, that we might know the things freely given to us by God, which things we also speak, not in words taught by human wisdom, but in those taught by the Spirit, combining spiritual thoughts and spiritual words. But a natural man, okay, call him a materialist, call him an atheist, call him a secularist, whatever you want to call him. He's a natural man. He believes in nature only, planet Earth only, the brain, the cells, physical life only. But the natural man does not accept the things of the Spirit of God. They're foolishness to him, and he can't understand them because they're spiritually appraised. But he who is spiritual appraises all things, yet he himself is appraised by no man. Verse 16, for who has known the mind of the Lord that he should instruct him? But we have the mind of Christ. He goes on in chapter 3 and explains how frustrated he is with the Corinthians because they're so fleshly in their thinking that he can't hardly have a spiritual conversation with them because they esteem things by the flesh and in the flesh only. I wonder though, is the soul or the spirit really such a silly idea? On this point, let's remember something. That the soul of man is not the same thing as the body of man, the brain included. The brain is an organ, like any other organ, and it can break down, it can malfunction, it can have problems, and it can break. But you're not any less of a human being when you lose a leg. You're not any less of a soul when you lose your arm. You're not less of who you are when you go blind. The brain is an organ, it can break down, but that doesn't mean that you have less of a soul. There is something that is still you inside of you that goes beyond the physical. There is something of your will, something of your desire, something of your decision-making capacity, something of your free will that goes beyond the physical. And one way that I like to look at it, here's your analogy. I have several analogies I want to talk about this morning to help us with this, but here's an analogy. I kind of think of life as a demolition derby, and you probably see it that way as well, especially if you've lived sort of a hard life. Life is kind of like a demolition derby, okay? And your car gets busted up and it gets smashed and the wheels fall off and maybe you lose your steering wheel somewhere along the way and you just close your eyes. And life is like a demolition derby and the car gets really smashed up. And at the end of all of it, when is the demolition derby over? Am I the only one who's been to a demolition derby? When is it over? It's when the last car finally dies. When all the cars have stopped working. And what happens? What happens when all is said and done and all the cars are dead? The people get out of them. The driver gets out of his mangled automobile, and here he is, helmet in the air, safe and sound. Because he had a roll cage around him, because he had seat belts on, and because really a demolition derby isn't there to kill anybody, it's just there to smash cars. At the end of the demolition derby, all the cars are dead, but the people, the drivers, get out of those cars and they're alive and well, ready for the next phase of their existence. Yes, we can break our legs and we can lose our eyesight. We can get cancer or worse. Our brains can be damaged. We can suffer from depression. We can have chemical imbalances, hormonal problems. We can even become disabled in many different ways. And at the end of all of it, every single one of us, hard life or not, the car is going to break down and die. And we're going to emerge from it a soul. Another point to remember is that no matter how smashed the car gets, there is still a will, a driving force within the car that is both connected to and yet independent from it. So that when the car finally dies, the driver can get out of the car and be independent from it. Your soul is connected to your body. Let's be real about it. When you break your leg, your soul is affected by it. When you lose your eyesight, your soul is affected by it. When your brain is damaged, your soul is affected by that. But when the car finally breaks down, when the body finally dies, your soul emerges from the mangled corpse, intact and whole, ready to face God in judgment. Otherwise, we're just locked in materialistic determinism. If you are nothing but your body, you are nothing but your genes, your DNA, your predispositions. You're nothing but your response to your five senses. And that is philosophically unacceptable, morally repugnant, socially impractical, and spiritually stifling. Even some of the greatest neurosurgeons in human history have believed that the mind must be immaterial and separate from the brain or the body. One of these pioneers in the field of neuroscience was Wilder Penfield. In his fascinating book called The Mystery of the Mind, he noted the way that during brain surgery, some people would be awake, conscious. Remember, that was back in the day. They'd be conscious during brain surgery, and he could stimulate one part of the brain with an electrode, and it would make an arm fling like that. And then he could put the electrode on another part of the brain, and it could make somebody babble, blah, 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 something like that. And he could stimulate different parts of the brain and make the body do things. Now, he would ask the patient later on, did you know that you were doing that? And the patient would respond. In his words, he said, I didn't do that. You did. I thought that was really interesting to think about. The brain is an organ separate from the will of humankind. You can manipulate the brain. You can break the brain. You can poke and prod the brain with an electrodes. And yes, it can make your body do things, but that doesn't mean you are doing it. He went on to say, Penfield's own words, that there is no place in the cerebral cortex where electrical stimulation will cause a patient to decide. I thought that was a great point. For my own part, he goes on to say, after years of striving to explain the mind on the basis of brain action alone, I have come to the conclusion that it is simpler and far easier and more logical if one adopts the hypothesis that one being does not consist of two fundamental elements. That our being, he says, that our being does consist of two fundamental elements, which is mind or soul and body. Maybe one more analogy might help with this. If you think of the soul and the body like sitting in an airplane, if all you believe in is the material, then all you see is what's within the fuselage of that airplane. You only see the seats in front of you and the seat that you're sitting on. You see the cup of Coca-Cola that's on the tray in front of you, the person sitting next to you, the air that you're breathing. You are only aware of the things within that fuselage that are interacting with you. That's the materialist. That's the naturalist. That's the atheist. That's all he sees. The spiritual person turns his head and looks out the window, though. The spiritual person realizes that, yes, I'm very much connected to the things within the fuselage. I'm very much connected to the air that I'm breathing, the atmosphere within here, the seat that I'm sitting on, and the other people who are sitting in this plane with me. But when I look out the window, I realize there is another element to my existence that is not contained within this airplane. There's something bigger out there, something brighter, something that goes beyond the definition of what I see here. I believe, and I hope that you believe as well, that we have a soul. But if that soul is eternal, then it will outlast the body, which leads us to our next question. What happens to my soul after I die? That's a tougher question, isn't it? That's a tougher question. Because the Bible lays it out fairly simply. It's simple, yes, hard to accept, though. That for those who lived a life of righteousness and did the good deeds and believed in God and obeyed Him, that there is life eternal. And it is a place of light. It is a place of beauty. It is a place of glory. And for those who refused to believe and refused to live by God's will, there is a place of darkness. It is a place of rejection, of fire that burns for all eternity. That's difficult to accept. Let's define hell. Hell is the final place of the souls who are unrepentant and rebellious. 1 Thessalonians chapter 1, I think, does a very good job summing up what hell is going to be. He says in 1 Thessalonians chapter 1, I believe we want to go to 2 Thessalonians. That's a misprint there on 2 Thessalonians chapter 1, verses 8 and 9. He says, dealing out retribution to those who do not know God and to those who do not obey the gospel of our Lord Jesus. And these will pay the penalty of eternal destruction. Notice this, away from the presence of the Lord and from the glory of His power. Now, I know that there's a lot of fanciful ways that we think of hell, and we're kind of captivated by Dante's Inferno and things like that, and we see hell as being something that our culture has built. An image, a stereotype. You know how I think the Bible describes hell? The Bible describes hell as being away from the presence of God. And yes, I suppose in a spiritual sense there will be spiritual fire, and there will be spiritual brimstone. And there will be spiritual pain and spiritual torment. I understand all of that. But the worst part of hell is not going to be fire. The worst part of hell is not going to be any pain. The worst part about hell is going to be separation from the presence of God. Because in that place, there is no hope, and it is only darkness. It is a place of weeping and gnashing of teeth, Matthew 8, verse 12, and of darkness, Matthew chapter 22 and Matthew 25 and verse 30. It is a place where the punishment is everlasting and never abates. In the book of Mark, in Mark chapter 9, several times Jesus uses the words, where the worm does not die and the fire is never quenched. What that means is that it is a place where the pain never stops. At least on planet Earth, if you fell into a fiery pit, eventually you'd die and it would be over. Eventually the pain would stop. But in hell, there is no cessation. There is no end. There is no relief. It is where souls are cast out, where souls are rejected, as the term Gehenna applies. When you see the word hell in the Bible, often it comes from the word Gehenna, which is the refuse heap outside of the city of Jerusalem. Interesting backstory behind the word Gehenna, of course. Gehenna is the word for place of, or valley of Hinnom, actually. It's the place of the valley of Hinnom. And when you look at the story of the place of the Valley of Hinnom, the Valley of Hinnom was the place where the king Ahaz from Jerusalem, the southern tribe, Judah, it's where he went out to offer his children as sacrifices to Molech. And he led the people of Judah out to the Valley of Hinnom to do the same thing with their own children. So it became this place of Molech worship and child sacrifice. And when Josiah comes along, and Josiah brings about all of his spiritual reforms, he defiles the Valley of Hinnom because of what they did there. And he turns the Valley of Hinnom from a place of worshiping Molech and offering sacrifices to basically Jerusalem's garbage dump. It becomes the place of the garbage dump. And it served that purpose all the way until the time of Jesus. Now they would light a fire there in the garbage dump to reduce the fire to ashes so they could continue to add things to it. They'd throw dead bodies in there of those who were unclean. They'd throw dead animals in there and garbage from the city. And they'd keep that fire going at all times, again, to reduce the pile down. So then when Jesus uses the term Gehenna, he says, that place is Gehenna. Where your soul goes for eternity is Gehenna. What he's saying is, look outside the city. Right outside. Do you see the column of smoke rising from the Valley of Hinnom? Do you see the column of smoke rising from the refuse pile? That is hell. Ooh, when you start to think of it like that, hell becomes a very, very unpleasant place. Extremely undesirable. You're cast out, you're rejected. And it's not just that you're cast out and rejected, you're cast out and rejected as if you were refuse. Is hell fair, though? Is it fair for God to send people to hell? Is it fair for God to judge people based on the things they've done in this life when there were so many temptations and so many things going against us, and we had trials and tribulations and discouragement and frustration and depression, and there were so many cheap alternatives that were offered, cheap, quick fixes? Is that fair for God to judge us and send us to hell? Is it fair for there to be an eternal punishment for mistakes and sins that were committed during a temporal life? In a book called Through No Fault of Their Own, one writer had this to say: even the question, is it fair, is hardly appropriate. Christians know that the judge of all the earth will assuredly do what is right. Another writer goes on to say, that eternal punishment is neither unjust nor unworthy of God is evidenced by the unexpected appropriateness of God's permitting the righteous and the wicked to realize their last dream, that goal to which their whole moral life tended. Listen to this. Is it not evidence of God's final act of mercy to all that each is granted the unchangeable privilege of loving or hating Him forever, of living with Him or apart from Him forever? The impenitent continue to insist until at last, because they will not accept what God offers, that judgment grants them what they always desired. But to their endless chagrin, they discover too late that their desires were self-destructive and horribly mistaken. So because they shall have eternally what they desired, which is life apart from God, it shall be eternal punishment. What Fowler is saying there in his commentary on Matthew is this. What would you expect God to do? What do you expect God to do? If you spend your whole life rejecting God and saying that there is no God, I don't believe in God, God is nonsense, God is a fairy tale, God is a giant spaghetti monster in the sky, if you spend your whole life saying there is no God, I don't want to have anything to do with God, what do you expect God to do in the afterlife? But to grant you your life's wish, to grant to you your ultimate dream, which is that you get to spend eternity apart from God. It's what you always wanted, and now you have it. But like Fowler says, at that point it's too late. Because you realize the thing that you always wanted in life, the thing that you always dreamed about, the thing that you always fought for and argued for, the thing you always debated till you were red in the face, it is the thing that brought about your ultimate self-destruction. Is hell fair? In that sense, hell is the most fair thing that he could do to the unrepentant. 2 Corinthians 5 and verse 10 says, "We must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ, that each one may be recompensed for his deeds in the body according to what he has done, whether good or evil." Deuteronomy chapter 30, verses 19 and 20. "I call heaven and earth to witness against you today that I have set before you life and death, the blessing and the curse. So choose life in order that you may live, by loving the Lord your God, by obeying his voice, and by holding fast to him." Choose life. It's set out before you as a very simple equation. Simpler than 1 + 1 = 2. Is hell even for you? Are you even supposed to go to hell? That's an element that people forget about, isn't it? That God didn't even design hell for you. And God also didn't design hell where it was going to be Satan's headquarters. We have this idea from The Far Side. I love The Far Side by Gary Larson. We have this idea, if you ever read the Far Side comic, that hell is like Satan's headquarters, and hell is like where Satan sits in his office and he builds like little card towers or something in his office while he waits for souls to come. And they're funny, and it's a fanciful way to view hell, but when you read in Matthew 25 and verse 41, you actually find out that hell is going to be just as bad for Satan as it is for us. He says, "Depart from me, accursed ones, into the eternal fire which has been prepared for the devil and his angels." Think about that. He did not prepare hell for you or for me. God didn't build hell and say, well, I've got to make sure that it's going to fit enough people for all the people who are going to be. He didn't make hell for us. He didn't design it with us in mind. His intention was for us to go to heaven. His desire was for us to go to heaven. His work in sending Jesus Christ was to bring us to him. He made hell for the devil and his angels. And hell is going to be just as bad for Satan as it is for us. Now, the next big question, probably the toughest one of all, and I believe this is going to get us to the end of our lesson. I'll give you a warning in advance here. I had too much material today, so I think we're going to have to turn this into a 2-part lesson. I don't think anybody's opposed to that, because if we're going to talk about heaven, we want to give heaven its due time, and I don't want to rush through a section on heaven. So we'll bring our lesson to a close with this question. Who is going to be condemned to hell? I think if I was going to come up with like a top list, a top 3 or top 10 list or whatever, of the top questions that I get as a preacher, I would have to say right near the top is, who is going to go to hell? Now, I'll say this, first of all, that it's a question I'm always very hesitant to answer. I don't like answering the question. I don't like giving you any kind of definitive answer on it. And here's why. Because any time that I sit here and say, who is going to heaven or hell, you know what I've just done? I just took God's chair. How many of you have a dad or a grandpa who has his chair? You know, that chair, the ugly, gigantic lazy boy in the living room that's all indented, like that's his chair. And you never sit in his chair. No one ever sits in his chair. When you come along and say, these people over here, they're all going to heaven, and these people over here, they're all going to hell. You know what you just did? You just took God's chair. It is not for us to decide who goes to heaven and hell. Like 2 Corinthians 5 said, like we've already read, we're going to stand before the judgment seat of Christ, and He is going to judge us for what we have done in the flesh, whether good or evil. And it is His decision. It is His prerogative. Like we read in John chapter 5 at the beginning of the lesson, God granted unto Jesus Christ the Son alone the judgment. And it will be Christ alone who judges. It will be Christ alone who gives life to whoever He wishes. You know who's going to go to hell? Whoever God sends to hell. Do you know who's going to go to heaven? Whoever is under the umbrella of God's mercy. I believe that I am under the umbrella of God's mercy. I believe that I have done what needs to be done to put myself in a position to receive grace. And I believe God is a gracious God who overlooks my sins, who overlooks my mistakes, my faults, my misconceptions, and will welcome me into the eternal abode. I don't know about you, though. I'm not inside your head. And I don't get to be there on the judgment day and listen to what God has to say about your life. Do you know who's going to be condemned? It doesn't matter. The question is not about who's going to be condemned. The question is, are you going to be condemned? Are you going to be saved? And more often than not, when people start talking about who's going to heaven and who's going to hell, you know what it is? It's a smoke screen. It is a question that people use because they don't want the attention on themselves. And so they'll say things like, well, if I become a Christian, then that must mean I have to condemn my dad or my grandpa or my spouse to hell. If I become a Christian, what does that say about my Baptist grandfather? If I become a Christian, what does that say about my Mormon friend? If I become a Christian, what does that say about all my friends and all my relatives and all my co-workers who are not Christians? You know, my answer is, what does it matter? If you're using this question as some kind of a smoke screen to get out of responsibility to God, then what does it matter? What about all those people on that little tiny island in the Pacific Ocean? Huh? What about all those people in that tribe on that little ocean or on that little island in the middle of the ocean who never hear the gospel? They don't have a Bible. They don't even speak English. So even if you showed up and preached to them, they wouldn't understand a word you were saying. What about all those people? What about all the people who never have an opportunity to hear about Christ and never can have an opportunity to hear about Christ? What about them? And again, smoke screen, plain and simple. That's all it is. It's a smoke screen. It's a deflection. It took the question of obeying God off of you and you threw it away onto somebody else and said, aha! That's all it is. You know, the thing about it is, what God chooses to do with souls who never knew Him or could not have ever known Him is God's prerogative. Romans chapter 9, verses 14 and 15, God says, I'll have mercy on whom I have mercy. That's my decision. I will show mercy to whoever I want to show mercy to. It is not your job or your decision. And if God chooses to show mercy to individuals who literally, practically, physically never could have known, whether because of isolation or social conditions that prevented it, I don't know. If God chooses to show mercy to those people, then praise be to God. All that shows is the extent of His mercy. But it's not my job to decide. I don't get to decide if they go to heaven or hell. And the same is true of great religious thinkers who do not happen to fit the criteria of the New Testament for what we would consider to be saved. People say, well, what about Martin Luther? Huh? What about Martin Luther? What about Mother Teresa? You know what? That's not my decision. But you know what is my decision? When I read Mark 16, verse 16, and it says, he who believes and is baptized shall be saved, my decision is what I'm going to do with my soul. God will save who He wants to save, and He will condemn who deserves to be condemned. The question is, what are you going to do? What are you going to do? We each will bear the responsibility of our souls. But I'll say this, based on Luke chapter 19 and the story of the rich man and Lazarus, all of your friends and relatives who you care about so much, who choose not to become Christians, I guarantee you one thing. They don't ever want to see you again. The rich man in this story was in a burning place of torment, and he begged Abraham, do something. Warn my brothers so that they might not end up in this place as well. Honestly, I don't know if your grandpa, if your best friend, if your relative, I don't know if they're in heaven or hell. I don't know what's going to happen to them, but I guarantee you this. If that relative or that best friend is burning in a place of torment at this time, he or she never wants to see you again. Because they don't ever want to see you again because they don't want you to be in the same place. Take their warning. Take their warning and obey. Whatever needs you might have, please come forward as we stand and sing.